Today I'm walking the trail from Lake Tekapo up to Ōtaiwai, Mount John. It's a few hours inland from Christchurch, New Zealand, and a place I used to come a lot as an undergrad studying astronomy at the University of Canterbury. At the top of this hill are some of New Zealand's biggest telescopes, and so I wanted to take this chance to talk about one of New Zealand's greatest astronomers. She changed the study of galaxies forever, and she was the first to grasp that galaxies, just like the stars within them, evolve with time. We are lucky to be able to look at pictures of space, like recent ones from the JWST, and know a little bit about what we're looking at. Each dot is a galaxy. That's an unfathomable truth given how large our own galaxy is. And much of the science that goes on today trying to understand these dots was spearheaded by an astronomer from a small New Zealand town. Her name was Beatrice Hill Tinsley. She was a trailblazer, and as I walk up this hill today, I'm going to share with you her story. Much of what I know about Beatrice I've learned in this book, Bright Star by Cristine Cole Catley. It was a hard book to find. I got this copy from an old and rare bookstore in Otago, and it happens to be an old library copy. And it's a shame this book isn't more popular because I think that more people should know about Beatrice. She was born Beatrice Hill in England in 1941, but came to New Zealand as a baby and grew up in New Plymouth. As a young girl, there were a few books about astronomy that really fascinated Beatrice. One in particular was Fred Hoyle's The Nature of the Universe, which asked questions such as, how was the universe created? At age 14, Beatrice was hungry to know more and asked to borrow some physics textbooks from her school teacher's bookshelf. She worked through them by herself. A couple of years later, that same teacher was injured in a car accident just weeks before the school's final exams. Beatrice led her class to study without their teacher, and in the final exam, the students got excellent marks. This teacher later said that very occasionally you realize you're dealing with a mind that is infinitely superior to your own. Beatrice came into that category. I would call her a genius. Beatrice graduated at just age 16 from New Plymouth Girls High School with top marks in her year, and she went on to study at the University of Canterbury, the same university I went to. She didn't like rote learning and preferred to teach herself interesting ideas. In a letter home from university, she wrote that she was sick of working for exams and decided to sit in the back of lectures and work on learning new maths rather than listening to the lecturer mumble through calculus she had learned at school. During her time at Canterbury, Beatrice decided that she wanted to be a cosmologist, but that wasn't really a topic offered at the university at that time. This observatory that I'm walking to now wasn't built when Beatrice was a student, so she had to do a different research topic for her master's thesis. Its title was Theory of the Crystal Field in Neodymium Magnesium Nitrate. Even though it wasn't the topic that she was passionate about, it gave the added benefit of giving her skills using a computer, and she was one of the only people in the country who got those kind of skills, and that helped her later in her career. She got all A's at university and was the only woman in physics at master's level. She also won every academic prize available to her, including the Hayden Prize for Physics, which I also won 55 years after her. I do feel connected to Beatrice in lots of little ways. And she also won a postgraduate scholarship to continue her studies. However, her path after university wasn't so streamlined, and she faced many difficulties in continuing her studies. She got married at age 20 to fellow physics student Brian Tinsley. They moved together to Dallas, Texas. At the time, there were anti-nepotism laws that prevented both a husband and wife from being employed at the same institution, and Beatrice hadn't known this when she got married and felt betrayed. It prevented her from continuing her research because Brian was already employed in Dallas. Feeling like her potential was languishing, Beatrice took matters into her own hands and decided to find somewhere that would let her do a PhD, even if it meant a long commute. At the University of Austin, a 5-hour bus ride away, she managed to convince a professor to give her a chance. They told her that most students struggle to complete the program in 6 years working full-time, but she needed to do it part-time, splitting her time between Dallas and Austin. There is a comment in Catley's book about the this time saying that Beatrice used her scholarship to pay for all the travel, plus Brian having to eat out half the week. This comment disturbed me a little. I guess it's evident that Brian wouldn't be expected to cook for himself, and it doesn't sound like Beatrice also got the luxury of eating out. It's only a small comment, but it does start to speak to the realities of her married life, which she later described as being like a prison for her. Regardless, she did very well at her PhD, and she astounded the professors and fellow students by scoring the first ever 100 on an exam there. In a letter home to her New Zealand family, she described the topic of her thesis by saying, "I will be studying a whole lot of different theories of cosmology to see which is best able to explain the observations made with optical and radio telescopes on different galaxies. The theories are based on Einstein's general relativity." Around the time of starting to write up her thesis, Beatrice was thrown a curveball. An unmarried member of her husband's family became pregnant, and at that time the baby would need to be adopted out. Beatrice was unexpectedly thrust into motherhood, feeling compelled to adopt the baby boy named Alan. She wrote up her thesis while taking care of the baby, and remember how I said most students take 6 years to finish? Well, Beatrice made such impressive progress that she was able to finish it in under 3 years. An examiner at her oral presentation said it was such powerful work that they should simply award her the PhD then and there without asking any questions, although they did continue to ask some just to meet the formalities. So what was her PhD work? Well, we can take a look at her thesis. Its title was Evolution of Galaxies and its Significance for Cosmology. In it, she made some of the first quantitative predictions of how galaxies will change over time by looking at how the stars are evolving within them. She showed that galaxy evolution is something that can be observed, and this was to grow into one of the largest subfields within the study of galaxies. She looked at the process of star formation and at how those stars would evolve and affect the recycling of dust and gas in the interstellar medium. This would shape the fate of the galaxy itself, and Beatrice was able to model this interconnectedness. Previous to Beatrice's work, it was thought that galaxies could be used as standard candles to measure distances in space because they didn't change, but Beatrice showed that galaxies could dim with age. This had profound effects on how astronomers came up with theories of the fate of the universe. Without this insight, the leading theory had been that the universe would collapse in a big crunch. Taking into account the changing nature of galaxies meant the data now looked more in favor of the universe expanding forever. Further observations 30 years later, using supernovae instead of galaxies as those standard candles, were to show that the expansion of the universe was in fact speeding up under the influence of what astronomers call dark energy. Despite producing a great PhD in record time, Beatrice felt deflated after this achievement. She returned to Dallas with no job prospects. She did apply for some grants to try and continue her research from home and had short visiting stints at places like Caltech. She also adopted a second child, Teresa. From all that I've read so far, it is clear that Beatrice loved her children and did all she could to put them first. It's also clear that these years post-PhD were a real struggle for her personally. When she'd moved to Dallas for her husband's job, it had been with an understanding that it would only be temporary, but nearly 10 years later, she was still waiting for her turn to start her career. Everyone that met Beatrice could see her potential and see how bright she was. After a long time struggling, she knew that getting a divorce from Brian would be the only way that she could shine. She was offered an academic position at Yale and wanted to take the children with her, but Brian didn't want her to. To avoid the children being fought over in court, she gave way and moved to Yale on her own, continuing to visit and help with childcare arrangements when she could. These aren't the kind of details I usually mention too much in my videos, and a case of people splitting up and having children live with one parent is an extremely common occurrence. In this case, though, Beatrice seems to have received quite a lot of criticism on the matter. Her daughter Teresa was later quoted in a New York Times article saying that even though it was painful, she was proud that her mum stood her ground and followed her career. Moving to Yale, Beatrice finally got to work on the questions that she had been inspired to answer as a child reading Hoyle's book about the origin of the universe. One of her papers was featured in Time magazine, which is why she posed for this photo shoot at the blackboard. She published over 100 papers, and looking through them, you can see topics like chemical evolution, abundance ratios, metallicity distribution, and even dark matter. These are all topics that make up the modern field of galactic astronomy, and Beatrice was involved in all of them. Her most impactful paper was published in 1980 called The Evolution of Stars and Gas in Galaxies. It received thousands of citations, and its longevity is seen in the fact that papers published this year are still citing it. In it, Beatrice describes different aspects of galactic evolution, such as gaseous inflow and the composition of the interstellar medium. She called them pieces of a jigsaw puzzle that may someday be put together. Another notable achievement of Beatrice's was that she organized a big galaxy conference at Yale in 1977, which has been described as the single most important galaxy conference in the history of the subject. She also became Yale's first female professor of astronomy. But at the height of her career, this story took a tragic turn. Just a year after becoming a professor, she noticed a bleeding mole on the back of her leg that she had previously ignored. She was diagnosed with melanoma and underwent treatment. During this time, she still kept busy and looked after Teresa, who had come back to live with her. Beatrice continued to work throughout her illness, but over the course of a few years became very sick as treatment failed to save her. Her PhD students visited her bedside and she helped them with their work. She continued to work on her own research too, and wrote her last paper from her bed in the Yale infirmary. She had to learn to use her left hand in order to write it out. It was called Chemical Evolution in the Solar Neighborhood 4, Some Revised General Equations. It was submitted 10 days before she died in March 1981, and it was published after her death. It includes calculations showing how to separate living stars from dead remnants, and thus making models more consistent. And that building over there is where the astronomers work today. And inside there's a small library with a bound copy of Beatrice's PhD thesis. As an undergrad, I got to stay there and meet Alan Gilmore and Pam Kilmartin, who, using one of the telescopes here, discovered an asteroid in August 1981 that they named Beatrice Tinsley. Beatrice's father, Edward Hill, called it a kind of moving tombstone. There are some other small traces of her legacy across New Zealand, like this street in Auckland named after her, and Mount Tinsley near Queenstown. But still, many New Zealanders don't know about Beatrice and her impact on our understanding of the big questions. Beatrice was friends with Vera Rubin, whose work on galaxies provided key evidence for the existence of dark matter. I'd like to end with Vera's words about Beatrice. She said, even in her all too brief a life, Beatrice was one of the giants of astronomy in the 20th century. There is no telling how much more we might have learned if she had had a longer time to teach us. While researching for this video, I saw that Cristine Catley's daughter, Nicola Scott, is currently driving an attempt to make a movie about Beatrice based on her mother's book. I hope this goes ahead and that Beatrice's legacy can continue to shine on. Thank you for watching, and thank you to my Patreon supporters for making these videos possible. A special shout out to today's Patreon cat of the day, Thorin.